The bustling streets of the city were alive with the hum of activity, the neon lights from the high-rise buildings flickering above as the evening rush hours settled into the soft hum of city life. Despite the noise, Marcus King was no stranger to moments of quiet in a world that never seemed to stop moving. As the CEO of one of the most influential tech companies in the country, he was used to being on top. His name had become synonymous with success, innovation, and power in the world of business. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, he was just Marcus, a man who had learned to appreciate life's smaller, quieter moments. Today, he was seated at a small corner table in a modest cafe, tucked away on the less-traveled streets of the city. A far cry from the luxurious penthouse he called home or the sleek glass-walled offices where he made decisions that impacted thousands of lives. The cafe was an old, family-owned establishment, its cracked walls and faded posters telling stories of generations that had come before. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm croissants filled the air, the sounds of clinking cups and murmured conversations creating a sense of serenity that Marcus rarely allowed himself. At the table across from him sat Maya, his younger sister, a sharp and ambitious lawyer who had always been his closest confidant. While Marcus ran the empire of technology, Maya fought battles in courtrooms, her voice carrying the weight of the law in ways Marcus never could. Though their paths were different, they shared one thing in common: a deep understanding of the world's inequalities. It was part of their shared history, one they never discussed openly, but one that shaped every decision they made. "Everything going okay with the company?" Maya asked, her eyes scanning Marcus's face as though searching for any sign of strain. His appearance, though polished, tailored jacket, crisp shirt, and sharp tie, belied the restfulness in his posture. He was always composed, but there was something about today that made him seem more at ease. Marcus smiled, a quiet but genuine gesture. "Better than I expected, but I've been thinking a lot lately about the world outside those walls." He gestured vaguely towards the window, as if the skyline of glass and concrete beyond could summarize everything he was feeling. "You ever wonder if we've lost touch with what really matters?" Maya raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical but intrigued. "What do you mean by that?" Marcus hesitated, then leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering as if to shield the conversation from the prying ears of the cafe. "I've spent years climbing this ladder, Maya. I've made every sacrifice to get to where I am. But when was the last time I actually saw the people I'm supposed to help?" His voice trailed off as he looked around the room, the small, humble cafe serving as a stark contrast to his world of suits, boardrooms, and cutting-edge technology. Maya followed his gaze, her lips pressing into a thin line as she processed his words. "You're not responsible for fixing everything, Marcus. You've already done more than most people will ever do." His eyes met hers, and for a moment, they shared a quiet understanding, an acknowledgement of the weight they both carried as people who had risen above their circumstances but never escaped the realities of those same circumstances. "I don't know," Marcus said, his tone quiet but earnest. "Sometimes I feel like my position should mean more than just business deals. Maybe I'm supposed to be doing something else with it. I just don't know what that looks like yet." Maya nodded, not pushing him further but not letting him off the hook either. "You'll figure it out. But don't forget, the world isn't always what it seems. People see power, money, status, and they think they understand you. But what do they really know about who you are?" Marcus smiled again, this time with a touch of humor in his eyes. "True. The closer they get to the glass walls, the less they see inside." He chuckled lightly, but the laughter felt hollow. He had become used to being judged for the life he had built, but there were moments like this one, where the judgment from others felt like an ever-present shadow. As they continued talking, an older woman came up to their table. She was small, with graying hair and a sweet but tired smile. Marcus had seen her around the cafe before. She was part of the quiet world that existed outside his high-powered life. "Excuse me, sir," the woman said, her voice a little shaky. "I couldn't help but notice. You're Marcus King, aren't you?" Marcus looked up at her, with the practiced politeness that came from years of public interactions. "Yes, ma'am. That's me." She smiled, a touch of awe in her expression. I read about your company in the news. You've done amazing things. I just wanted to say that I'm proud of you, young man. You're making all of us proud." Marcus nodded, offering a polite smile in return. "Thank you. I appreciate that." The woman hesitated for a moment, then seemed to find her courage. "I don't mean to interrupt your lunch, but could you maybe help my son? He's been trying to get into a tech program, but they keep turning him away because of his background. I know you're busy, but maybe you could just take a moment to—" Before she could finish, Maya placed a hand on Marcus's arm. He didn't flinch, but the shift in his demeanor was noticeable. "I'm sorry," he said, cutting the woman off gently but firmly. "I can't help you with that right now. I'm not in a position to interfere with admissions processes." The woman's face fell slightly, and she turned away, walking back toward the counter. The silence between Marcus and Maya lingered for a few moments before Maya spoke. "You didn't have to turn her down like that," she said, her tone sharp, though her expression remained neutral. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "I don't have the time or the resources to play hero, Maya. The world doesn't work that way." "I know," Maya said softly. "But that's the point. You can make it work that way if you chose to. You got the power, Marcus. People see what you've built, but not everyone gets the same chance as you did. You could do more than just lead a company." The words stung, not because they were untrue, but because Marcus had heard them before, and they always seemed to ring louder in moments like this one. He leaned back in his chair, watching the older woman as she gathered her things, her shoulders hunched in a way that told him she'd been rejected before. Maybe not just by him, but by the system she was fighting against every day. The conversation lingered in Marcus's mind long after the woman left, a subtle weight pressing against his chest. He was used to people being impressed by his success, but there were moments like this, moments when the truth became undeniable, that made him wonder if he was doing enough. Outside the cafe, a black SUV pulled up, its sleek, glossy finish contrasting sharply with the dim light of the neighborhood. A security detail emerged, and one of the men approached the cafe door. "Mr. King," he said, his tone respectful but firm. "There's an urgent matter requiring your attention." Marcus didn't hesitate. He stood, dropping a few bills on the table and giving Maya a look that conveyed his apology for the abrupt end to their meeting. "I'll be back later," he said, and without waiting for a response, he followed the agent out the door. As he stepped into the car, the weight of the moment hit him harder than it had before. The world outside this quiet cafe, with all its complexities and challenges, was waiting for him and his power. But was it enough? Was he using it the right way? The car door slammed shut behind him, and as the vehicle pulled away from the curb, Marcus couldn't help but wonder if the world he had built was one he could truly be proud of. The answer, for now, was unclear. But Marcus was beginning to understand that answers, sometimes, could only come after taking the first step. As the car sped down the city streets, Marcus stared out the window, his thoughts heavy with the conversation he had just left behind. It was rare for him to feel unsettled, but the interaction with the woman in the cafe had lingered in his mind, a sharp reminder of the limitations of his success. The city whizzed by, the gleaming skyscrapers and the worn-out streets below them a stark contrast. The world outside his world felt so different, so distant. The SUV pulled into the parking garage beneath his office building, and Marcus was ushered through the sleek, modern hallways toward his penthouse office on the top floor. But even the glittering surfaces and modern design couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. As he walked past the security desk, the guard, a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense demeanor, looked him up and down briefly before giving him a polite nod. "Mr. King, good afternoon. Your schedule's been updated. You've got a meeting with the board in 10. Marcus smiled and nodded. "Thanks, Tim." As he moved past the guard's desk, he couldn't help but notice the slightly curious look Tim had given him. The glance wasn't malicious, but it was a small reminder. Marcus King, the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, still had to prove he belonged in certain spaces. Inside the elevator, Marcus adjusted his tie, standing tall as the doors slid shut. He'd been here countless times, but today, it felt different. There was an unsettling weight to the air, as though something was about to shift in ways he couldn't predict. When the elevator reached the top floor, he was greeted by his assistant, Andrea, who handed him a folder of materials for the board meeting. Her smile was warm but faint, as though there was something beneath the surface she wasn't saying. "Everything good, Andrea?" Marcus asked, glancing at her for a moment before taking the folder. She paused, then nodded. "Just a few last-minute changes with some investors. They're expecting more from you today, that's all." Marcus glanced down at the folder in his hands, a slight furrow forming on his brow. "All right, I'll handle it." He had been in this world long enough to recognize when things were tense, when the expectations of the board or shareholders came with a little more pressure. But this felt different. It was as though the world outside of his powerful, corporate life was encroaching in ways he hadn't considered. The boardroom was filled with the usual faces: sharp suits, cold stares, polite nods. The conversation quickly turned to the upcoming merger and the company's position in the tech industry. Marcus had built his empire, but this was the kind of meeting where his position, despite its success, was often questioned. As he presented, he noticed it again, the subtle but undeniable shift in how people looked at him. There was a hesitation in the way some of the board members addressed him. Careful, calculated. And even though they relied on his leadership to drive profits, there was a quiet undercurrent that he could feel. The assumption that, despite everything, he wasn't really one of them. Marcus had learned long ago to brush aside the microaggressions and half-hidden glances. He had a reputation for being professional, focused, and direct. But the tension in the room felt palpable, the same sense of exclusion he had dealt with throughout his career. "We need to ensure this merger aligns with our brand," Sarah Adams, a senior board member, said, her voice clipped. "I trust you've anticipated any challenges the tech community might have with us moving into this market?" Marcus met her gaze, his tone steady. "We've done the research. We've accounted for every variable. It's a seamless transition. I'm confident that we can dominate in this sector, just like we have in the others." The room fell into a silence, each person scrutinizing his response. Sarah's eyes lingered on him a moment longer than necessary, before she glanced over at David, the head of acquisitions. Marcus could almost see her mental checklist of qualifications and preconceptions being drawn up. The tension escalated slowly, like a temperature rising. It wasn't that they doubted his competence. It was more a matter of his place. Marcus had been in meetings like this too many times to count, where his authority was more an assumption than a truth, where every word he spoke was met with careful assessment, as if they were waiting for him to slip up. As the discussion continued, Marcus kept his calm, navigating the conversation with the kind of composure that had gotten him to this point. But in the back of his mind, a thought kept gnawing at him. Why is this always harder for me? The meeting concluded with polite nods and assurances from the board members. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of being treated as something less than what he had earned. The room cleared, leaving him standing alone in the sleek, glass-paneled space. Andrea came up to him, the corners of her mouth twitching into a sympathetic smile. "How'd it go?" Marcus shrugged, not bothering to mask the fatigue in his voice. "It was fine. Same as always." "Are you sure? You looked a little off. Did something happen?" He thought about the way the room had shifted in subtle ways. Their assumptions about his competence, their quiet hesitations. The way Sarah Adams had looked at him like a man who had yet to prove himself, despite all he had accomplished. "It's just, I don't know, Andrea. Some days it feels like they can't see beyond my skin." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she just nodded. "I get it, but you're right where you belong. You've worked harder than anyone I know to be here." Marcus smiled at her reassuring words, but even as he nodded his thanks, a seed of doubt had been planted. He could feel the weight of history in every glance that bypassed him. The world he occupied wasn't his world. It was a world that allowed him in only as long as he fit the mold they had created for him. And as much as he had fought to break through, there were moments when he could still feel the barrier that separated him from the rest. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and emails, but the weight of the earlier encounter stayed with him. As evening drew near, Marcus found himself needing a break. He needed something simple, something untainted by the power struggles and business deals that had defined his life. He decided to leave the office early. He made his way down to the parking garage, nodding to a couple of the staff members on the way out. When he reached his car, the driver was already waiting for him. But just as he was about to step inside, a voice called out from the shadows. "Mr. King." Marcus turned, surprised to see a young man standing near the back of the garage. He was dressed casually, a black hoodie and worn jeans, his face partially obscured by the dim light. There was something in his eyes, a quiet determination mixed with caution. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Yes." The young man hesitated, then took a step forward. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need help. I've been trying to get a foot in the door with the tech industry, and I've been rejected everywhere. I've been working for years, but no one will give me a chance." Marcus felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. This was the kind of thing he encountered daily. People who felt the same frustration, the same rejection he had once felt. The difference was he had made it. He had found his place. And yet, standing here in the cool garage, facing this young man, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had become part of the system that had shut out so many others like him. "I understand," Marcus said, his voice calm, "but I don't have the power to give you a job or make calls for you. The system is what it is, and it's not easy to break into, especially for people who don't have the connections." The young man's face fell slightly, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he stepped closer. "I know you understand. I've heard your story, how you started with nothing and made it to the top. But it's different now. It's harder." Marcus's chest tightened. "I didn't say it wasn't hard. I've worked for everything I have." "I know. But what you don't know is that it's not just hard. It's stacked against us. People like me, people from where I'm from, we never get the same chances. So when someone who's made it doesn't help, it feels like a door is closing. Like we never had a chance to begin with." The words stung more than Marcus expected, and for a moment, he stood frozen. The air seemed to thicken, the unspoken truth weighing on him. He could feel the bitterness in the young man's voice. He was a mirror, one that Marcus had avoided looking into for too long. Before Marcus could respond, the young man took a step back. "I'll figure it out, but thanks for listening." Marcus watched him disappear into the shadows, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the empty garage. As he slid into the back seat of his car, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the world had just become a little smaller, and that the walls that had once seemed so easy to climb were now closing in on him. The rain came down in sheets, thick and fast, slapping against the windows of Marcus's penthouse as he sat at his desk, eyes fixed on the phone in his hand. The moment had arrived, and he could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him. The world outside, the city, the noise, the relentless hum of progress seemed to fade, leaving him in the silence of his thoughts. His pulse quickened, his mind racing. The board meeting earlier that day had gone well enough, but it wasn't that meeting that gnawed at him now. It was the young man in the parking garage and the face of a city that had already closed so many doors. Marcus looked down at the papers scattered across his desk. Contracts, mergers, emails. It was all familiar, all the same. But this felt different. He had worked for everything he had, but every victory had come at a price. Every climb up the ladder had required a deliberate and sometimes exhausting effort to prove himself. Yet now, as he sat in this sleek office, surrounded by luxury and status, he couldn't escape the feeling that none of it was enough. He wasn't just fighting the system anymore. He was of the system, and that fact made it harder to breathe. His phone vibrated again, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Andrea. "Marcus, there's something you need to know. I just overheard a conversation that might affect the deal with the East Coast investors. Someone's digging into your past, and they're bringing up some unsavory things. I'm not sure what's going on, but be careful." Marcus felt a cold sweat spread across his back. He knew exactly what this meant. Someone was trying to pull the rug from under him, and he had no idea who or why. He had been in the game long enough to understand the stakes, but the personal cost was higher than ever before. He couldn't shake the feeling that his success was becoming a target, his very presence in these circles a threat to the status quo. Without responding to Andrea, Marcus stood up, pacing across the room, his mind spinning. He thought back to the parking garage, to the young man whose face had mirrored his own struggles. The reminder of how deep the divide still ran in this world, how no matter how much Marcus achieved, he would always be seen as an outsider by some. The words that had lingered with him. People like me, we never get the same chances, echoed in his mind. This was the same system that had tried to shut him down, to shut others down, and now the tide was rising again. The message was clear. Either he played the game, or it would consume him. Marcus's jaw clenched as he stared at the wall. What if he was just another pawn in the system's game? He had always fought to move beyond it, to be more than just a stereotype. But now, with the weight of everything crashing down on him, he was wondering if the game was rigged. He was fighting for survival, for his place in this world, and it was becoming clear that this fight wasn't going to be won behind the safety of boardrooms and glass walls. The phone rang, snapping him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Mitchell. Marcus, Mitchell said, his voice tense. We need to talk. I heard about what happened at the office. Things are getting bad, real bad. Someone is digging into your personal life, your past. They're trying to use it against you. You have to know who's behind this before it escalates. I know, Marcus said, his voice low. I just got word. Andrea's telling me the same thing. It's like I can feel it coming. What the hell is going on, Mitch? There's a rumor about a project. Something in your past that wasn't exactly by the book, Mitchell continued, his voice laced with concern. And now the investors are getting nervous. You can't ignore this, Marcus. They're circling, and they're already painting a target on your back. Marcus's grip on the phone tightened. What project? What are they talking about? I don't know yet, but it's enough for them to make calls, Mitchell said. If you don't take control of this, it's going to get ugly. We can't keep this under wraps forever. The knot in Marcus's stomach tightened further. His mind raced to all the decisions, all the compromises he'd made over the years to get to this point. He had done everything by the book, or so he thought. But it didn't matter how he got here. The truth was that the system he had worked so hard to master was now turning on him. Mitchell, I'm not backing down, Marcus said, his tone harder now. They want to dig into my past? Let them. They want to use it against me? Fine. But I'm not going to let them take me down without a fight. There was silence on the other end of the line. Marcus could feel Mitchell's hesitation. His old friend had always been a cautious voice, the kind who steered clear of confrontation unless absolutely necessary. But Marcus knew that this time, things were different. He wasn't just fighting for his career anymore. He was fighting for his identity, his place in a world that didn't want him to exist at the top. I'm in, Mitchell said after a pause. But be careful. If they come after you, it's going to be a war. You won't be able to fight it with just money and power. This could destroy everything. Marcus's resolve hardened. Let them come. I'll fight with everything I have. The line clicked off, leaving Marcus standing there, his mind whirling. He didn't know what this project was that had them so upset, but he could feel the pressure building. What had once been a carefully curated life, a life built on hard work, perseverance, and sacrifice, was now under attack. And just as his success had been questioned in subtle, everyday ways, now it was all being dragged into the open, scrutinized by people who had never seen the cost of his ascent. The stakes had just gotten higher, and Marcus was beginning to understand that this wasn't just a business battle. It was a personal war. The following days blurred into a haze of meetings and phone calls. The tension between Marcus and the board had escalated. Whispers spread through the office halls, and the news about the questionable project was starting to leak. Marcus couldn't tell who the source was, whether it was one of the board members or someone further up the food chain, but it didn't matter. The cracks were already showing. At the next board meeting, Marcus sat at the head of the table, his face calm, but his mind racing. Every set of eyes around the room was watching him, some with skepticism, others with barely concealed suspicion. The board members were nervous, their hands tapping on the table, their glances exchanged like a silent communication. Sarah Adams, the same woman who had questioned him earlier, was there again, her gaze sharp as she looked over the documents before her. Marcus, Sarah began, her voice cool and calculated. We've received some disturbing reports about your past involvement with an unapproved project several years ago. Can you explain? The words landed like a slap. Marcus straightened in his chair, the familiar professional mask slipping into place. He had no idea what she was talking about, but he wasn't going to back down. I don't know what you've heard, Sarah, Marcus said, his voice steady. But I can assure you, everything I've done for this company has been within the law. If there's something in my past you need clarification on, I'll provide it. But I'm not going to let baseless rumors dictate our future. The room fell into a heavy silence. Some members looked down, others exchanged uncertain glances. But it was Sarah's gaze that pinned him. She had a glint of something in her eyes. Satisfaction? Triumph? You're not the only one questioning your record, Sarah continued. We're being pressured from the investors to reevaluate your leadership, Marcus. They're concerned that this might be bigger than just a project. This could be a systemic issue. A cold wave of realization swept over Marcus. They weren't just attacking him. They were trying to dismantle everything he had built. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the system that had allowed his rise and now wanted to tear him down. They were using the same weapon against him that had been used to push so many others like him aside. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. If you think this is going to shake me, Sarah, you're wrong. I've faced worse than this. But I'll tell you one thing. You won't tear down this company over rumors. The moment hung in the air, and Marcus could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. This wasn't just a battle for control. It was a battle for dignity, for survival in a world that didn't want him to succeed. As the meeting dragged on, Marcus's mind was already working. He needed to find out who was behind this. He needed to know who was trying to strip him of his power, and he needed to strike before they could do it to him. The storm had arrived, and Marcus was prepared to face it head-on. The day had started like any other. The early morning fog had settled over the city streets, and Marcus King, as usual, had been up before the sun. The world was still asleep when he walked into his office at the top of his towering skyscraper. But today it was different. The air was thick with tension, and the usually familiar rhythm of his routine felt more like a countdown to something inevitable. Something huge was coming. The news about the past project, the one they were now weaponizing against him, was everywhere. Whispers had reached the highest levels of the board, and Marcus knew he was no longer just facing a smear campaign. The storm was here. His empire, the company he had built from the ground up, was now under siege. The walls were closing in, and the enemy wasn't just one individual. It was the system that had once lifted him to the top and was now looking for any reason to tear him down. Marcus was alone in his office, pacing, staring out over the skyline, feeling the weight of everything bearing down on him. His phone had been buzzing constantly with messages from Mitchell, Andrea, even some board members, all trying to gauge his next move. But Marcus wasn't sure what move to make next. He couldn't just sit back and let them destroy him. He couldn't be the man who was swept away by the same forces that had once worked so hard to suppress others. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Mitchell, his longtime friend and colleague, and the one person Marcus knew he could rely on. Mitchell's expression was grim as he entered, taking a seat across from Marcus. "We need to talk," Mitchell said, his voice strained, more urgent than Marcus had ever heard it before. Marcus nodded, sinking into his chair. "I know. I'm hearing the same things. The board is split, and the investors are breathing down our necks." Mitchell leaned forward, his eyes flicking to the door, making sure they were alone. "It's not just that. There's more. Someone high up is pulling strings. They're not just trying to discredit you. They want to destroy everything you've built. And it's not just business, Marcus. It's personal." Marcus gut twisted. He knew Mitchell wasn't one for dramatics. If he was saying it was personal, it meant something much worse than just a corporate sabotage attempt. Who's behind this? Who are they really trying to take down? Mitchell hesitated, eyes flicking around again. "I don't know yet, but I'm getting whispers. There's a report, underground, from inside the company, and it's damning. Someone's been collecting information on you, on your past, not just the project, but everything before it. I don't know how, but it's all coming to light." Marcus's chest tightened. His past was full of decisions he wasn't proud of, things done in the name of progress, ambition, and survival. He'd always known that some skeletons could be brought to light, but to have his every action questioned, to have his very identity used against him in this way, it felt like a betrayal. "So, what do we do now?" Marcus's voice was colder now, every word measured. "You fight back," Mitchell replied, his face resolute. "You don't let them use your past to tear you down. We go on the offense. You start exposing them. Whoever is behind this, they need to know they can't hide anymore. Marcus stood up from his desk, moving to the window, his hand resting on the cool glass as he stared out over the city. His thoughts were a storm, the weight of the situation threatening to overwhelm him. He'd fought for every inch of this life, this success. He'd made his way through a system that had tried to keep him out at every turn, and now, after all these years, it was the same system that was trying to push him back down. He wasn't going to let that happen. But how could he fight back? Who was his real enemy? The door opened again, and Andrea walked in. She had a look of concern etched on her face, her eyes darting from Marcus to Mitchell. She'd always been the calm one, the one who saw things more clearly than the rest of them. If she was here now, it meant things were dire. "Marcus, I don't think you fully understand what's at stake," Andrea said, her voice quieter now, more cautious. "There are people in the company, outside the company, who are willing to go to extreme lengths to take you down. If this goes public in the wrong way, it won't just cost you your career. It'll cost you everything. Your reputation, your legacy, your future." Marcus clenched his jaw, his hands resting on the edge of his desk. "I've made it this far with nothing but hard work. Now, they want to use my past to destroy me. What do you suggest I do, Andrea? Crawl into a hole and disappear?" She stepped closer, her voice softening. "I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is we have to be careful. We have to take control of the narrative. We can't let them turn this into something it's not. You have to make the first move, Marcus. You expose them before they can expose you." He stared at her, his mind spinning. They were right. He had to act first. He had to make sure the truth didn't become something twisted in the eyes of the public, used as a tool to discredit him. But just as Marcus was about to speak, his phone buzzed again. He looked at it, then passed it to Mitchell. Mitchell's eyes narrowed as he read the message aloud. "We know what you did. This is just the beginning. You've made a powerful enemy." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "Who sent this?" Marcus demanded, though he knew it didn't matter. It was a warning, a threat, and it was a sign of just how deep this conspiracy ran. "Doesn't matter. We need to deal with this, Marcus," Mitchell said, his voice urgent. "You can't go into this alone. You have to act now." Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of the situation. "Fine. Get everyone we need. This ends today." The meeting was set up quickly. It was supposed to be a private discussion, a strategy session with a few trusted allies. Marcus had called in his closest confidants, Mitchell, Andrea, and a few other key people who had stood by him through thick and thin. But Marcus wasn't naive. He knew it wasn't just about dealing with the leaks, the rumors, or the sabotage. This was the beginning of a war, and he had to be ready for what came next. When they gathered in the conference room, the mood was grim. Everyone was on edge, the air thick with unspoken fears. Marcus could feel the pressure building, but it wasn't just his personal stake anymore. It was about the people in this room, the legacy he had worked for, and the company that had flourished because of their combined efforts. "This isn't just about protecting me," Marcus began, his voice steady, but carrying a weight none of them could ignore. "This is about protecting everything we've built. It's about showing the world that what they're doing isn't just about me. It's about a system that's rigged against all of us." Mitchell spoke up first. "We need to expose them before they can expose you. We can't let this go public until we've got all the facts. If we go in half-cocked, they'll tear us apart. We need to be smart." "I agree," Andrea added, her gaze sharp. "If we push too hard, we'll make them fight back. And we don't know who's really behind this yet." "We need leverage," Marcus said, his voice hardening. "If they want to drag my past out into the open, then I'll drag theirs too. I don't care how high up this goes. I'll burn the whole system down if I have to." As the conversation continued, the realization sank in. Marcus wasn't just fighting to save his company. He was fighting for control of his life, for the right to stand on his own terms. And with every passing minute, the stakes were getting higher. The meeting ended, but Marcus could already feel the walls closing in. They had a plan, or at least the beginning of one. The team was mobilizing, gathering information, and getting everything ready to take the fight to those who had decided he was expendable. But just as Marcus was about to head out of the conference room, his phone buzzed again. The message was simple, chilling. "We're watching you. It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. Marcus King was standing at the edge. His resolve was tested like never before. It was clear now, this wasn't going to be just a corporate struggle. This was war, and he wasn't going down without a fight. The boardroom was quiet, too quiet. The polished wood gleamed under the harsh overhead lights, reflecting the faces of the men and women who sat around the massive conference table, their eyes fixed on Marcus. But it wasn't just silence that hung in the air. It was something far heavier, a waiting game. A moment of truth was approaching, and everyone in the room knew it. Marcus had spent the last few days preparing for this. The leaks, the smear campaigns, the corporate sabotage, it had all led to this point. It had all been building up to the final showdown. The board members, many of whom were just as implicated in the system of power that had once helped elevate Marcus, had made their move. They'd turned against him, buying into the rumors, the distorted stories about his past, his so-called missteps. What they didn't realize was that Marcus had already set the pieces in motion to expose the truth. His comeback wasn't just a personal fight. It was a reckoning for the entire system. Mitchell was at his side, a reassuring presence in the storm of corporate tension. Andrea had done her part too, using her connections to make sure the most damning pieces of evidence were ready. Now, it was time for Marcus to confront those who thought they could control him, who had decided that his worth could be calculated by their own metrics of success. Or worse, his skin. The board members had already made their arguments. Their words had been thinly veiled threats, implying Marcus's downfall was inevitable. They believed they had the power, but what they hadn't counted on was Marcus's own fire. The man who had fought his way from nothing was not the same man who would cower in the face of their greed and manipulation. And now, they were face to face in this room, with nowhere to hide. Marcus, one of the senior board members, Derek Harrington, began, his voice laced with a quiet venom. I think we've all seen the writing on the wall. You've overstayed your welcome. The company needs fresh leadership, someone who understands the weight of... I'm sorry, Derek, Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. Did you just say that to my face after everything I've done for this company? The room went still. A few of the board members shifted nervously, sensing the tension building in Marcus's words. Marcus, another voice, Caroline Griffin, the CFO, spoke. This isn't personal. It's just business. You've made too many mistakes. You've made your share of enemies, and you can't expect us to ignore that. The press is already picking up on it. It's over. Marcus leaned forward, meeting her gaze head-on. His eyes were calm, but they burned with a quiet fury. No, you're wrong, Caroline. This isn't over. It never was. And don't you dare pretend that this is about business. This is about control. You and the rest of the board have made your decision. But here's the truth. It's not my mistakes that are the problem. It's yours. The words hit like a slap. Silence fell over the room again as everyone digested what Marcus had just said. Derek opened his mouth to protest, but Marcus raised a hand. You've been playing the game all wrong. For years, you've been covering up your own corruption, your own greed, hiding behind this veneer of business decisions. But that's not what this is. You want me out because I represent everything you wish you could be. I'm the one who made it, despite the odds. And now you want me gone because I'm a reminder that it doesn't have to be the way you've been running things. You think you can throw me out like a pawn? Well, guess what? I'm not the pawn in this game. You are. The room was a mixture of shocked gasps and uncomfortable shifting. But Marcus didn't care. The time for quiet diplomacy was long over. He had nothing to lose anymore, except the truth. I've got something for you, Derek, Marcus continued, standing up and walking towards the large flat-screen monitor on the wall. You think you can bury me? Fine. But let's see what happens when the truth comes out. With a click, he connected his laptop to the screen. A series of documents appeared. Photographs, emails, financial records, and leaked internal memos. They painted a picture that none of the board members expected, one that implicated many of them in unethical and illegal dealings. The photos showed evidence of backdoor deals, bribery, and fraudulent accounting practices. The emails detailed plans to cut corners, manipulate stock prices, and hide information from investors and regulators. We've been sitting on these for days, Marcus said, his voice quiet but filled with authority. And now the world will see them. The question is, Derek, do you really want to be on the other side of this? Derek's face paled as he glanced at the documents on the screen. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced by a creeping dread. You're bluffing. Am I? Marcus replied, his tone low and cutting. I've been playing by the rules for years, trusting the system. But now it's clear. The system is broken, and you've been part of that system. The board members shifted uneasily, exchanging glances. No one had expected Marcus to come at them like this. They thought they could control him, dictate the narrative. But they hadn't realized just how deep Marcus had dug into their own dirt. They hadn't seen the fight in him until now. But it wasn't just about the documents, about exposing corruption. Marcus knew there was something more at stake here. This was a battle for his life, his legacy, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. You think you're untouchable, Marcus said, his voice now rising with an intensity that made the board members sit back in their chairs, their faces filled with guilt and fear. But the truth always comes out. It doesn't matter how many favors you've called in, how many people you've silenced. The truth will always find a way. The silence in the room was deafening. For the first time, the board members were realizing the full weight of their actions. And it wasn't just the documents they feared. It was what came next, the public fallout, the lawsuits, the media frenzy that would tear apart everything they had worked so hard to build. Mitchell, standing near the door, watched Marcus with a quiet sense of pride. Andrea, too, had been quietly working in the background, making sure the media was ready to pick up on the story. But even though they had done everything they could, the final moment, the final decision, lay with Marcus. This was his fight, his stand. Marcus turned back to the board members, his voice now cold and unyielding. Here's the deal. You either resign and let me take over, or this all goes public. You can't have both. You can't keep hiding behind your lies, your manipulation, and think that you'll come out of this unscathed. The world is watching now. The investors are watching, and you've got nowhere to run. Derek opened his mouth, trying to summon some semblance of authority, but he faltered. His words caught in his throat. That's it, isn't it? Marcus pressed. You know I'm right. You can't keep this up anymore. The truth is here, Derek. You've got two choices. Resign, and I'll make sure you go out with some dignity. Or fight back, and I'll make sure you're remembered as a criminal. The room was now a standoff, the tension palpable. Marcus's chest was tight with adrenaline. He knew this was his moment, but he also knew it wasn't over yet. The board members were cornered, but they still had power, connections, and a ruthless determination to protect their status. A voice broke the silence. It was Caroline. You think you're the only one who has power here, Marcus? You think you can just waltz in and take over? We'll make sure you regret this. You don't know what you're up against. Marcus stared at her, his eyes unblinking. I already know exactly what I'm up against. You're all just pawns in a system that's trying to destroy me. But I won't let you. Not today, not ever. And just as the last word left his mouth, there was a loud bang. Someone had kicked open the door. The world seemed to freeze for a second. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he saw who walked in. It was someone he had least expected. His greatest ally, Mitchell, was standing there, but behind him, in the doorway, stood a stranger. Let's just say, Mitchell said, his voice steady, that we're not the only ones who want to see this game end. The room fell silent, as everyone turned to see who had just walked in, and what the next move would be. The boardroom was like a battleground, each side entrenched and resolute, but Marcus was ready. He had anticipated this moment for weeks, playing out every scenario, every strategy, and every word in his head. But now, standing face to face with the men who had once been his allies and now sought to tear him down, the weight of the situation settled in. This wasn't just a corporate coup. It was personal. They had underestimated him, his resolve, and the lengths to which he would go to expose their lies. Derek Harrington, the chairman of the board, stood at the head of the table, his eyes cold, calculating. Marcus, it's over. The board has decided. You're done. The company doesn't need your leadership anymore. You've made too many mistakes, and frankly, we don't have faith in your ability to turn this around. Marcus leaned against the table, his arms crossed, a sharp contrast to the calm that appeared on his face. His mind raced, but outwardly, he was the picture of poise. He had built his empire from nothing, faced countless obstacles, and each time he had risen above them. Now, in this moment, he was fighting not just for his career, but for his dignity, for the integrity of everything he had built. "You've got a lot of nerve, Derek," Marcus replied evenly, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "You're here talking about mistakes, about faith. But you're forgetting one thing. I didn't make any mistakes. You did. You let your greed blind you to the truth. You let your prejudice drive your decisions. And now you think you can throw me out like I'm nothing. Well, I'm not going down that easy." The room fell still, the board members exchanging nervous glances. Marcus could feel the weight of their scrutiny, but his resolve was unwavering. He wasn't going to be cowed by their threats or their attempts to intimidate him. The pieces were in motion. He had prepared for this. Caroline, the CFO, spoke up, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Marcus, don't make this harder than it has to be. You're only making things worse for yourself. Just let go of the reins. This will all be over soon." But Marcus wasn't done. He straightened up, his gaze never leaving Derek's. "What you don't realize, Caroline, is that I'm not the one making things worse. You are. You've been using this company as your own personal playground, and now it's time for the truth to come out." With a deliberate motion, Marcus pulled a stack of documents from his briefcase and slapped them down on the table in front of him. They were the final pieces of evidence: the emails, financial records, photographs of the illegal deals, and the internal memos that exposed the corruption that had been festering beneath the surface for years. The room collectively gasped as they saw the damning evidence laid bare. "You think you've been covering your tracks," Marcus said, his voice low and steady. "But you missed something. You thought you could bury the truth, but you can't hide forever. These documents? They're the end of your little empire. The public's going to see them, and when they do, the fallout won't just be on me. It'll be on all of you." Derek's face twisted in fury as he slammed his fist on the table. "You don't have a clue what you're up against, Marcus. You think this is just about some paperwork? You think you could take us down with a few pages? You're out of your depth." Marcus's eyes never wavered. "No, Derek. You are the one who's out of his depth. You've been playing a game you didn't understand, and now the whole world is going to see how deep the rot really goes." There was a long silence. The tension in the room was thick, as if the very air itself were holding its breath. Caroline looked around, her face pale as the truth began to sink in. "Derek, what is this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "This can't be real, can it? These accusations, they're too serious." But Derek wasn't backing down. His eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward. "You think you've won, Marcus? You think this is going to change anything? You're just one man, a man who's about to lose everything." Marcus took a deep breath, and for a moment, he felt the weight of the past few years, the sleepless nights, the constant battles, the constant compromises. He had fought to get here, fought to get to a place where he could make a difference. And now, standing in front of these men, he realized just how much they had underestimated him. They thought they could crush him, but they hadn't counted on his resilience, his ability to outthink them at every turn. "I'm not the one who's going to lose everything," Marcus said, his voice firm, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "You're about to lose your careers, your reputations, everything you've built because of your own greed. And when the truth comes out, when the public knows what you've done, it won't just be a story about me. It'll be a story about you, about how power, unchecked and unchallenged, can destroy everything." Derek's face turned red with rage, his eyes flickering with a mix of fury and fear. But Marcus saw something else, a crack. The facade was breaking. Derek wasn't the powerful man he pretended to be. He was just another coward, too afraid of the truth to face it. "You can't do this, Marcus. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." Derek spat, his voice low, filled with venom. "You're right," Marcus said, his eyes hardening. "I have no idea what I'm getting into, but I've been fighting all my life, and I'm not about to stop now." Just as Derek opened his mouth to respond, the door to the boardroom swung open with a force that made everyone jump. The tall figure of Mitchell appeared in the doorway, his face unreadable. Behind him, a man Marcus had never seen before stepped into the room. A stranger, but someone who carried himself with a quiet authority that immediately drew attention. "This meeting is over, Derek," Mitchell said, his voice cool but firm. "And the game you've been playing? It ends today." The room erupted into chaos as Derek and Caroline exchanged confused glances, trying to process the sudden intrusion. But Mitchell wasn't here to explain himself. He was here to make sure Marcus had the support he needed to finish what he'd started. "Who the hell are you?" Derek demanded, his voice trembling with anger. The stranger stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "My name is Derek Owens," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "I'm here to ensure that justice is done." The weight of the name hit the room like a brick. Derek Owens, civil rights attorney, known for his unrelenting pursuit of justice against corrupt systems. The man who had toppled more than one powerful figure with his relentless work. The man who was now standing beside Marcus, ready to dismantle the empire Derek had built on lies. "You got to be kidding me," Derek scoffed. "You think you could just waltz in here and make threats? This is a business matter." "This is not just a business matter," Derek Owens said, his voice calm, but filled with an undeniable authority. "This is about corruption, manipulation, and abuse of power. And we're not going to let you get away with it any longer." Marcus watched as the board members shifted uneasily, their faces a mixture of disbelief and fear. For the first time, they realized just how deep Marcus had been prepared to go, and the truth had finally caught up with them. "I've got the evidence," Owens continued, "and we've already started the process of exposing what's been going on here. The press is already involved. Once the story breaks, you'll be the ones on the defensive." Derek's face twisted with rage, but he knew he was outmatched. For the first time, he seemed uncertain, vulnerable. His posture faltered, and he glanced at the other board members, who were now visibly uncomfortable. "You can't do this," Derek said weakly, his voice a shadow of the confidence he once had. "You can't ruin everything we've built." "You did that," Marcus replied, his voice quiet but heavy with truth. "You've been ruining people's lives for years, all to line your pockets. Now it's time for the world to see who you really are." As Derek and the rest of the board sat in stunned silence, the finality of Marcus's words sank in. The confrontation had reached its peak. But Marcus knew it wasn't over yet. This was just the beginning. The battle for justice was far from won. But today, he had made sure the first shot had been fired. With Owens at his side and the truth in his hands, Marcus knew that this wasn't just about corporate greed or power. This was about something bigger, a fight against the systems that kept people like him down. And as the board members exchanged uneasy glances, Marcus knew that the tide was shifting. But there was still so much left to do. The weeks that followed the climactic boardroom confrontation were a blur of media attention, legal battles, and public outcry. The storm that had been brewing for so long had finally reached its peak, and Marcus found himself at the center of it all. The weight of his victory was both empowering and humbling. He had exposed the deep-rooted corruption that had threatened to destroy everything he had worked for, but the true consequences of his actions were only beginning to unfold. The first major victory came quickly. Derek Owens, with his unyielding legal mind and relentless pursuit of justice, had already begun the process of holding the board members accountable. He worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, filing lawsuits, and putting pressure on the media. Within days, news outlets were buzzing with the explosive story of corporate corruption, and the names of Derek Harrington, Caroline, and the other board members were splashed across front pages and television screens. The public was outraged. People who had once admired the company's success now saw it for what it truly was: an empire built on lies, manipulation, and abuse. The city that had once been so willing to turn a blind eye to the corruption began to rise up. Protests sprouted in the streets, calling for accountability and justice. The voices that had been silenced for so long were now echoing in every corner of the country. Marcus was at the forefront of this wave of change. The press conferences, the interviews, the public speeches, it was all part of a greater mission, a mission to tear down the walls that had kept his people oppressed. But despite the overwhelming support from the public, Marcus felt the weight of the battle heavy on his shoulders. He had won the first round, but the fight was far from over. His personal growth in these weeks had been immense. The young man who had once dreamed of success and wealth now stood as a symbol of resilience and strength. Marcus had always been a fighter, but the years of navigating systemic injustice had tempered him into someone unyielding. In these weeks, he learned not just the power of standing up for himself, but the importance of standing up for others. Those who were not as fortunate, those who didn't have the luxury of power or influence. He had witnessed firsthand how systems of oppression could break a person, but he had also learned how to rebuild. He had been pushed to the brink, but instead of crumbling, he had risen, stronger, more determined, and with a greater understanding of what needed to be done. As the days wore on, Marcus found himself spending more time in the community. The calls for reform were growing louder, and he felt an overwhelming responsibility to ensure that the fight didn't end with the board's downfall. It was one thing to expose corruption, it was another to change the system that allowed it to thrive in the first place. Marcus knew that his battle had sparked something bigger, a movement for justice, a movement that would continue long after the cameras had left and the headlines faded. But even as he stood tall, there were moments when the emotional toll of the fight began to wear on him. His relationship with his family had been strained by the long hours, the constant legal battles, and the immense pressure of being the public face of the movement. His wife, Karen, had been supportive, but the weight of his mission had caused a divide between them. She had always been his anchor, but now, more than ever, she found herself questioning the cost of his ambition. His daughter, Jasmine, was proud of her father, but also scared. She saw the threats, the backlash, and the dangers that came with standing up to powerful men. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of meetings and press events, Marcus sat in the living room, the weight of the world on his shoulders. Karen walked in, her face tired but determined. "Marcus," she said softly, sitting beside him, "we need to talk." He looked at her, his eyes filled with exhaustion and the weight of everything he had been carrying. "I know, Karen. I know." She took a deep breath, her eyes flicking to Jasmine, who was in the next room, her face bathed in the soft light of a laptop. "You've been fighting for all the right reasons. But I need to know, what's the cost? What's this all been for? I see you, so determined, so consumed by all of it. But what about us? What about our family?" Marcus didn't have an answer for her right away. He had been so focused on bringing justice to the system that he hadn't fully realized how much he had neglected the people closest to him. He thought of Jasmine, her fear of the world, and her admiration for the man he had become. He thought of Karen, the woman who had always been his strength, his calm in the storm. But now, even she was questioning the path he had chosen. "I'm doing this for us, for you, for Jasmine," Marcus said finally, his voice rough. "I can't stand the thought of leaving this world the way it is, of leaving her to fight battles I could have stopped. But I hear you. I know I've been distant. I'll figure it out." The conversation didn't have a neat resolution, but it marked a shift in Marcus's heart. He couldn't lose sight of the people who had stood by him all these years, the people who had been his constant, even when the world around him seemed determined to tear him down. The fight for justice couldn't come at the cost of his family's peace. He promised himself, then and there, that he would find a way to balance both, the fight and the love he had at home. Meanwhile, the ripple effect of Marcus's actions continued to spread. The pressure on the board intensified. Legal proceedings dragged on, but each day brought more victories. Even as Derek Harrington and the others fought back with everything they had, their influence was crumbling. They had underestimated the power of a man who had nothing left to lose, and the public had rallied behind Marcus. The once dominant figures of the boardroom were now in free fall, their credibility shot, their every move scrutinized by the media, the courts, and the public. They had no choice but to step down, one by one, as the reality of their corruption came to light. But the systemic change Marcus sought wasn't limited to just one company. The fight was never just about revenge or exposure. It was about ensuring that the next generation didn't have to fight the same battles. As he continued to use his platform to push for corporate and social reform, he became an advocate for those who had been silenced for too long. People who had fought against systems of oppression but had no voice, no power to effect change. With the board members gone and the company in disarray, Marcus began the hard work of rebuilding, not just the company, but the system that had allowed so much corruption to flourish in the first place. He started by introducing new policies, ones that prioritized equity, diversity, and accountability. He worked closely with Derek Owens, who had become more than just a lawyer. He had become a true ally, helping Marcus draft initiatives that would change the company's culture from the inside out. It wasn't easy. The road ahead was filled with setbacks, resistance, and countless battles that needed to be fought. But Marcus was no longer the man he had been. He had faced the darkest parts of his own soul and emerged stronger, more determined. He wasn't fighting just for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, oppressed, or overlooked. And in that fight, he knew he would not be alone. The road Marcus King had traveled was long, filled with obstacles and setbacks that seemed insurmountable. From the humble beginnings of a young man who had never imagined his life would intertwine with corporate giants, to standing in the glaring spotlight as a symbol of justice, resilience, and integrity, he had been tested in ways he had never anticipated. What started as a fight against the personal betrayal of corrupt board members had transformed into something far larger. Marcus had not only exposed the corrupt practices that had plagued his company and tarnished its reputation, but he had also unearthed the deeply rooted systemic issues that had quietly festered in society for far too long. Through his journey, he had come to realize that his battle was never just about one company or even one instance of injustice. It was about shifting the narrative, breaking down walls, and showing that change, though difficult and painful, was always possible. A changed man, Marcus's growth. Before the confrontation in the boardroom, Marcus had always seen himself as a man working tirelessly to climb the corporate ladder. He had put in the long hours, the endless networking, and the strategic moves, all with the dream of building a better life for his family. But along the way, he had discovered that success had a hidden cost, one he had been willing to ignore for far too long. It was in the silence of his own conscience that the true calling for justice emerged. Marcus had always been resilient. He had been forged by the adversity he had faced growing up, but it was in the fight against corruption and in the defiance against systemic injustice that he found his true strength. The countless nights spent grappling with the question of what kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind, whether it would be one of wealth and personal success or one of justice and change, had propelled him forward. He had learned that true leadership wasn't just about achieving the highest title or building a company empire. It was about using that power and influence to effect change for the greater good. And so, Marcus had made a conscious decision. He would not allow the fight to end with a corporate victory. His battle had to transcend personal gain. It had to be about everyone, from those who were silenced in boardrooms to those marginalized by systems of power. In the months after the board members were removed and the company began the painstaking process of rebuilding, Marcus worked relentlessly to create new policies that would not only address corporate corruption, but would also promote equity, diversity, and fairness at all levels. His work wasn't just about cleaning up a company, it was about cleaning up the systemic rot that allowed such practices to thrive in the first place. The personal growth Marcus had undergone was evident to those around him. He had become an advocate, not just for the communities he served, but for the very idea that no one, regardless of their race, background, or position in life, should ever feel powerless in the face of corruption or injustice. He was, in every sense, a changed man, more aware of the fight ahead, but more determined to face it. Broader implications, a catalyst for change. The impact of Marcus's actions reverberated far beyond the walls of his company or the city he called home. What began as a corporate scandal morphed into a national conversation about corruption, racism, and systemic inequality. The media played a huge role in amplifying his story, but it was the grassroots support, the individuals who saw themselves in Marcus's struggle, that truly sparked the transformation. For the first time, people were talking openly about the ways in which powerful figures use their positions to silence others, to exploit the most vulnerable, and to perpetuate a system of inequality that benefited the few at the expense of the many. Marcus's story was not just one of personal redemption. It was a call to action for everyone who had ever been ignored, dismissed, or marginalized. His journey laid bare the brutal truth about the nature of systemic oppression, how deeply it was woven into the fabric of every institution, from corporations to government bodies. But more importantly, it also showed that this system could be dismantled, piece by piece, with enough resolve and collective effort. Marcus was not fighting against a single villain. He was fighting against an entire system that had long condoned injustice. And in doing so, he became a beacon of hope for others who had been silently suffering. This awakening was not just limited to those affected by corporate corruption. It transcended race, class, and industry. People from all walks of life rallied behind Marcus's cause, understanding that the battle for fairness was everyone's fight. The ripple effect of his actions had started a movement, one that would continue long after the media attention faded. There was no going back. Inspiration and hope for the future. Though the battle had been long and the scars of the journey would remain, Marcus's story ended on a note of hope. It was a hope rooted in the idea that progress was possible. His fight had not been easy. There were moments when the weight of the world seemed to rest on his shoulders, when the pressure from enemies and the doubts from his loved ones threatened to break him. But he had persisted, and in his persistence, he had not only transformed himself, but had become a symbol for others to follow. For the audience who had followed Marcus's journey, whether through the media, through the legal battles, or through the community-based efforts, there was a sense of inspiration. In the face of overwhelming odds, one man had stood up, had taken a stand, and had used his power for something bigger than himself. And as his story unfolded, the audience was reminded of the power of one person to make a difference. The challenges Marcus faced weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a much larger, much older problem. But his victory, though hard-earned, had proven that change was not only possible, it was inevitable if enough people had the courage to fight. And that, perhaps, was the most powerful message his story left behind. For anyone who had ever felt that their voice didn't matter, that their struggle was invisible, Marcus's journey was a testament to the power of standing up. It reminded us all that resilience was more than just a personal quality. It was a collective force, one that could challenge even the most entrenched systems of power. Closing, the fight continues. As Marcus walked hand in hand with his daughter, Jasmine, he knew that this victory was only a small part of a much larger fight. He had won one battle, but the war against injustice, inequality, and systemic corruption was far from over. Still, he felt a sense of peace, an understanding that no matter what came next, he had already made an impact. The fight for justice was a long one, but Marcus had learned that even the smallest acts of resistance, when done with conviction and purpose, could change the world. And that, perhaps, was the greatest lesson of all. As he stood at the helm of a new era, both personally and professionally, he knew that the road ahead would not be without its challenges. But Marcus was ready. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And in that moment, surrounded by the love of his family, the support of his community, and the unwavering strength he had discovered within himself, Marcus felt certain of one thing: the world was about to change. He was a catalyst, and there would be no turning back. The legacy of resilience, courage, and justice had only just begun.